Thousands of athletes from around the world have been competing for gold medals in the Italian Alps, a spectacle that has been watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But here's something almost no one knows. The men who founded the United States tried to ban sports entirely. Not just horse racing, not just gambling, all of it. Cockfighting, theatrical exhibitions, expensive diversions and entertainments, their words not mine. So, how did a nation that outlawed every species of extravagance and dissipation become one of the world's greatest Olympic powers? The answer lies in a founding era debate that still hasn't been settled. To understand this, we need to go back in time to Philadelphia in October 1774, and a document that almost no one reads today, but that shaped American culture in ways that we're still living with. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1774. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies came together to try and figure out how to resist British imperial policy without starting a war. On October 20, 1774, they passed the Articles of Association, 14 resolutions designed to unite the colonies through economic pressure on Great Britain. Now, tucked into Article 8, the delegates resolved to, quote, discountenance and discourage every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially all horse racing and all kinds of gaming, cockfighting, exhibitions of shows, plays, and other expensive diversions and entertainments, end quote. That wasn't an afterthought. It reflected a core founding belief. Virtue was fragile, and luxury was its enemy. This logic came from classical antiquity, sharpened by Enlightenment thinkers. Self-governing citizens must be capable of self-restraint. If you couldn't control yourself, how would you govern yourself, or anyone else for that matter? Now, as John Adams put it bluntly, public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. Now, sports, especially horse racing, cockfighting, and gambling, represented aristocratic excess, the kind of decadence that the founders believed had already corrupted Great Britain from within. Historian Kenneth Cohen calls it Republican asceticism, deliberate self-denial in the service of a common good. So people were denying themselves sports because they thought it was in the interest of the common good. But here's the thing. One of the most prominent members of the Second Continental Congress was living proof that physical culture and intellectual achievement could go hand in hand. Benjamin Franklin had been an athlete since childhood. Growing up in Boston near the Mill Pond, he taught himself to swim and became obsessed with the water. As a child, Franklin invented the first pair of swim fins. Think an artist-painter's palette. They were about 10 inches long with a thumb hole, and then he reported that they made him swim a lot faster, but they also fatigued his wrists. Now, in 1726, he was living in London as a young man. Franklin jumped from a boat into the Thames River and swam from Chelsea to Blackfriars, which is roughly 3.5 miles. He performed what he called many feats of activity, both upon and under the water. He so impressed a prominent British politician that the man asked Franklin to teach his two sons how to swim. Franklin actually considered staying in London at this point and opening a swimming school. But thankfully for the United States, he returned home to Philadelphia, where he swam in the Schuylkill River, and when he was serving as a diplomat in France, he swam in the Seine. In 1968, the International Swimming Hall of Fame inducted Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin is a Hall of Fame swimmer. Now, Franklin advocated for swimming as education. He promoted learn-to-swim programs for children, and he wrote guides for on-water safety. His philosophy presaged the Olympic ideal. Cultivate body and mind together in service of a complete human being. Now, the key distinction, Franklin saw physical activity as self-improvement, not as a spectacle. Exercise, yes, competition for its own sake, and that's where things got complicated. Now, another founding father, Thomas Jefferson, worked through this same tension, and he came down quite firmly on the side of the body. While he was serving in Paris as the United States' diplomat, he wrote to his teenage nephew Peter Carr in 1785, and Jefferson laid out advice that really wouldn't be out of place in a modern-day training manual. He said, quote, give about 2 of your hours every day to exercise, for health must not be sacrificed to learning. A strong body makes the mind strong. But Jefferson was also quite specific about the kind of exercise he thought Carr should pursue. Walking, above all else. Jefferson warned Carr that games played with a ball were too violent for the body and stamped no character on the mind. Jefferson also practiced what he preached. He tracked his walking pace across seasons took daily walks around Monticello, and rode his horse 3 to 4 hours a day into his late 70s. In 1812, at the age of 68, Jefferson wrote to John Adams, "I am on horseback 3 or 4 hours every day." The pattern? Individual physical self-improvement was good. Competitive spectacle was not good. The Republic values personal discipline, but not public performance. Now, long before the founders began debating the morality of organized sport, ordinary Americans had already built a tradition of winter recreation that connects directly to the Winter Games that we saw happening in Milan. Dutch and Swedish settlers brought ice skating and sleigh racing to North America in the 1600s. In New Netherland, which comprised parts of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, skating was ubiquitous. In 1659, a Dutch settler named Jeremias van Rensselaer wrote to his brother from near Albany, New York, that the Hudson River had froze so hard that with sleigh one could use the river anywhere, without danger, for the races, in which we now indulge a good deal. Now, skating was also an unusual sport for the era. It was one of the few physical activities that Dutch men and women pursued together. And that was something the English visitors always commented on with visible surprise, because in England, women didn't ice skate. Philadelphia lawyer Alexander Graydon declared that Philadelphians were the best and most elegant skaters in the world, without rules, without the Dutch commercial practicality, because the Dutch were using ice skating to transport their goods back and forth. The Philadelphians were skating just for the pleasure of it. And here's what's interesting about all of this. The tension that the founders identified between sport as moral danger and physical culture as civic necessity, that tension was never resolved. It simply evolved. After the Revolution, Americans began building a culture deliberately distinct from that of Great Britain. Cricket, which they had been playing, faded after the War of 1812, and a new American ball game emerged that eventually became baseball. Sport wasn't just recreation anymore. It was part of a national identity. And that's the pattern worth seeing. The founders didn't disagree about whether the body mattered. Every one of them, the ascetics and the swimmers alike, believed that physical fitness was tied to civic capacity. A strong body for a strong republic. What they disagreed about was the role of spectacle, of competition, of organized public glorified sport. Was watching a horse race a form of corruption, or was it really a form of community? Was athletic excellence a public virtue or a national symbol? The answer Americans eventually landed on, the answer that Team USA has embodied right now in Milan, is unmistakably both. When American athletes take to the ice or race down a mountain in the Italian Alps, they're participating in something the founders couldn't have imagined, and yet they would have recognized it in some essential way. The founding fathers would have been deeply ambivalent about the modern Olympics. The gambling, the celebrity, the commercialism, all of it would have set off alarm bells for them. The spectacle alone would have made John Adams very nervous. But the underlying idea that cultivating the body is inseparable from cultivating the mind, that a people needed both to be free, that physical excellence reflects something essential about a nation's character. That idea they would have recognized immediately, because they'd been arguing about it since 1774. Now, if you want to go deeper on any of this, the history of sport in early America, young Benjamin Franklin's world in Boston, or how Dutch settlers shaped American winter culture, I've linked Ben Franklin's World episodes in the description below. And if you found this useful, please subscribe. Every week, I connect the headlines that you're reading now with the history that explains why they're happening. The past has a lot to say about the present if you know where to look. And I'll see you in the next one.